Aesop was an ancient Greek fabulist or storyteller credited with a number of fables now collectively known as Aesop's fables. Although his existence remains uncertain and no writings by him survive, numerous tales credited to him were gathered across the centuries and in many languages in a storytelling tradition that continues to this day. Many of the tales are characterized by animals and inanimate objects that speak, solve problems, and generally have human characteristics. Scattered details of Aesop's life can be found in ancient sources, including Aristotle, Herodotus, and Plutarch. An ancient literary work called the Aesop Romance tells an episodic, probably highly fictional version of his life, including the traditional description of him as a strikingly ugly slave who by his cleverness acquires freedom and becomes an advisor to kings and city-states. Older spellings of his name have included Aesop and Aesopa. Depictions of Aesop in popular culture over the last 2,500 years have included several works of art and his appearance as a character in numerous books, films, plays, and television programs. Life. The name of Aesop is as widely known as any that has come down from Greco-Roman antiquity, yet it is far from certain whether a historical Aesop ever existed. In the latter part of the 5th century something like a coherent Aesop legend appears, and Samos seems to be its home. Martin Litchfield West. The earliest Greek sources, including Aristotle, indicate that Aesop was born around 620 BCE in Thrace at a site on the Black Sea coast which would later become the city Mesembria. A number of later writers from the Roman imperial period say that he was born in Phrygia. The 3rd century poet Callimachus called him Aesop of Sardis, and the later writer Maximus of Tyre called him the Sage of Lydia. From Aristotle and Herodotus we learn that Aesop was a slave in Samos and that his masters were first a man named Xanthus and then a man named Iadmon. Then he must eventually have been freed, because he argued as an advocate for a wealthy Samian, and that he met to his end in the city of Delphi. Plutarch tells us that Aesop had come to Delphi on a diplomatic mission from King Croesus of Lydia, that he insulted the Delphians, was sentenced to death on a trumped-up charge of temple theft, and was thrown from a cliff. Before this fatal episode, Aesop met with Periander of Corinth, where Plutarch has him dining with the 7 sages of Greece, sitting beside his friend Solon, whom he had met in Sardis. Problems of chronological reconciliation dating the death of Aesop and the reign of Croesus led the Aesop scholar Ben Edwin Perry in 1965 to conclude that everything in the ancient testimony about Aesop that pertains to his associations with either Croesus or with any of the so-called 7 wise men of Greece must be reckoned as literary fiction, and Perry likewise dismissed Aesop's death in Delphi as legendary, but subsequent research has established that a possible diplomatic mission for Croesus and a visit to Periander are consistent with the year of Aesop's death. Still problematic is the story by Phaedrus which has Aesop in Athens, telling the fable of the frogs who asked for a king, during the reign of Pisistratus, which occurred decades after the presumed date of Aesop's death. The Aesop Romance, along with the scattered references in the ancient sources regarding the life and death of Aesop, there is a highly fictional biography now commonly called the Aesop Romance, an anonymous work of Greek popular literature composed around the 2nd century of our era. Like the Alexander Romance, the Aesop Romance became a folk book, a work that belonged to no one, and the occasional writer felt free to modify as it might suit him. Multiple, sometimes contradictory, versions of this work exist. The earliest known version was probably composed in the 1st century AD, but the story probably circulated in different versions for centuries before it was committed to writing. Certain elements can be shown to originate in the 4th century BC. Scholars long dismissed any historical or biographical validity in the Aesop Romance. Widespread study of the work began only toward the end of the 20th century. In the Aesop Romance, Aesop is a slave of Phrygian origin on the island of Samos, and extremely ugly. At first he lacks the power of speech, but after showing kindness to a priestess of Isis, is granted by the goddess not only speech but a gift for clever storytelling, which he uses alternately to assist and confound his master, Xanthus, embarrassing the philosopher in front of his students and even sleeping with his wife. After interpreting a portent for the people of Samos, Aesop is given his freedom and acts as an emissary between the Samians and King Croesus. Later he travels to the courts of Lycurgus of Babylon and Nectanebo of Egypt, both imaginary rulers, in a section that appears to borrow heavily from the Romance of Orica. The story ends with Aesop's journey to Delphi, where he angers the citizens by telling insulting fables, is sentenced to death and, after cursing the people of Delphi, is forced to jump to his death. Fabulist Aesop may or may not have written his fables. The Aesop Romance claims that he wrote them down and deposited them in the library of Croesus. Herodotus calls Aesop a writer of fables, and Aristophanes speaks of reading Aesop, but no writings by Aesop have survived. Scholars speculate that there probably existed in the 5th century BCE a written book containing various fables of Aesop, set in a biographical framework. Sophocles in a poem addressed to Euripides made reference to Aesop's fable of the north wind and the sun. Socrates, while in prison, turned some of the fables into verse, of which Diogenes Laertius records a small fragment. The early Roman playwright and poet Ennius also rendered at least one of Aesop's fables in Latin verse, of which the last 2 lines still exist. The body of work identified as Aesop's Fables was transmitted by a series of authors writing in both Greek and Latin. Demetrius of Phalerum made a collection in 10 books, probably in prose for the use of orators, which has been lost. Next appeared an edition in elegiac verse, cited by the Suda, but the author's name is unknown. Phaedrus, a freedman of Augustus, rendered the fables into Latin in the 1st century AD. At about the same time Babrius turned the fables into Greek choliambics. A 3rd century author, Titianus, is said to have rendered the fables into prose in a work now lost. Avianus translated 42 of the fables into Latin elegiacs. The 4th century grammarian Dositheus Magister also made a collection of Aesop's fables, now lost. Aesop's fables continued to be revised and translated through the ensuing centuries, with the addition of material from other cultures, so that the body of fables known today bears little relation to those Aesop originally told, with a surge in scholarly interest beginning toward the end of the 20th century. Some attempt has been made to determine the nature and content of the very earliest fables, which may be most closely linked to the historic Aesop, physical appearance and the question of African origin. The anonymously authored Aesop Romance begins with a vivid description of Aesop's appearance, saying he was of loathsome aspect, pot-bellied, misshapen of head, snub-nosed, swarthy, dwarfish, bandy-legged, short-armed, squint-eyed, liver-lipped, a portentous monstrosity, or as another translation has it, a faulty creation of Prometheus when half asleep. The earliest text by a known author that refers to Aesop's appearance is Himerius in the 4th century, who says that Aesop was laughed at and made fun of, not because of some of his tales but on account of his looks and the sound of his voice. The evidence from both of these sources is dubious, since Himerius lived some 800 years after Aesop and his image of Aesop may have come from the Aesop Romance, which is essentially fiction, but whether based on fact or not, at some point the idea of an ugly, even deformed Aesop took hold in popular imagination. Scholars have begun to examine why and how this physiognomic tradition developed. A much later tradition depicts Aesop as a black African from Ethiopia. The presence of such slaves in Greek-speaking areas is suggested by the fable, Washing the Ethiopian White, that is ascribed to Aesop himself. This concerns a man who buys a black slave and, assuming that he was neglected by his former master, tries very hard to wash the blackness away. But nowhere in the fable is it suggested that this constitutes a personal reference. The first known promulgator of the idea was Planudes, a Byzantine scholar of the 13th century, who wrote a biography of Aesop based on the Aesop Romance and conjectured that Aesop might have been Ethiopian, given his name. An English translation of Planudes' biography from 1687 says that his complexion was black, from which dark tincture he contracted his name. When asked his origin by a prospective new master, Aesop replies, "I am a Negro." Numerous illustrations by Francis Barlow accompany this text and depict Aesop accordingly. But according to Gert-Jan van Dijk, Planudes' derivation of Aesop from Ethiopian is etymologically incorrect, and Frank Snowden says that Planudes' account is worthless as to the reliability of Aesop as Ethiopian. The tradition of Aesop's African origin was continued in Britain, as attested by the lively figurine of a Negro from the Chelsea porcelain factory which appeared in its Aesop series in the mid-18th century. It then carried forward into the 19th century. The frontispiece of William Godwin's Fables Ancient and Modern has a copperplate illustration of Aesop relating his stories to little children that gives his features a distinctly African appearance. The collection includes the fable of washing the blackamoor white, although updating it and making the Ethiopian a black footman. In 1856, William Martin Leake repeated the false etymological linkage of Aesop with Ethiop when he suggested that the head of a Negro found on several coins from ancient Delphi might depict Aesop, presumably to commemorate his execution at Delphi, but Theodore Panafka supposed the head to be a portrait of Delphos, founder of Delphi, a view more widely repeated by later historians. The idea that Aesop was Ethiopian seems supported by the presence of camels, elephants and apes in the fables, even though these African elements are more likely to have come from Egypt and Libya than from Ethiopia, and the fables featuring African animals may have entered the body of Aesopic fables long after Aesop actually lived. Nevertheless, in 1932 the anthropologist J.H. Dreberg, repeating the Aesop-Ethiop linkage, asserted that, while some say Aesop was a Phrygian, the more general view is that he was an African, and, if Aesop was not an African, he ought to have been. And in 2002 Richard A. Lobban cited the number of African animals and artifacts in the Aesopic fables as circumstantial evidence that Aesop may have been a Nubian. Folklore. Popular perception of Aesop as black was to be encouraged by comparison between his fables and the stories of the trickster Brer Rabbit told by African-American slaves. In Ian Colvin's introduction to Aesop in Politics, for example, the fabulist is bracketed with Uncle Remus, for both were slaves, and both were black. The traditional role of the slave Aesop as a kind of culture hero of the oppressed is further promoted by the fictional life, emerging as a how-to handbook for the successful manipulation of superiors. Such a perception was reinforced at the popular level by the 1971 TV production Aesop's Fables, in which Bill Cosby played Aesop. In that mixture of live action and animation, Aesop tells fables that differentiate between realistic and unrealistic ambition, and his version there of the tortoise and the hare illustrates how to take advantage of an opponent's overconfidence. On other continents, Aesop has occasionally undergone a degree of acculturation. This is evident in Isango Portobello's 2010 production of the play Aesop's Fables at the Fugard Theatre in Cape Town, South Africa. Based on a script by British playwright Peter Turson, it was radically adapted by the director Mark Dawnford-May as a musical using native African instrumentation, dance and stage conventions. Although Aesop is portrayed as Greek, and dressed in the short Greek tunic, the all-black production contextualizes the story in the recent history of South Africa. The former slave, we are told, learns that liberty comes with responsibility as he journeys to his own freedom. Joined by the animal characters of his parable-like fables, one might compare with this Brian Seward's Aesop's Fabulous Fables, which first played in Singapore with a cast of mixed ethnicities. In it, Chinese theatrical routines emerged with those of a standard musical. There had already been an example of Asian acculturation in 17th-century Japan. There, Portuguese missionaries had introduced a translation of the fables that included the biography of Aesop. This was then taken up by Japanese printers and taken through several editions under the title Aesopo Monogatari. Even when Europeans were expelled from Japan and Christianity prescribed, this text survived, in part because the figure of Aesop had been assimilated into the culture and depicted in woodcuts is dressed in Japanese costume.